Okay, so then today we're going to continue to talk about conditional statements. And what we're going to start off by doing is write a conditional. In if-then form. So I'm actually on page 108 and I'm looking at example 2A. And you're given this statement that 4/4 can be exchanged for a $1 bill. For a $1 bill. All right, that's a statement that you're given. And if you're asked to write a conditional in if-then form, we're going to read this statement. 4/4 can be exchanged for a $1 bill. In this statement, the hypothesis is 4/4 can be exchanged. The conclusion would be a $1 bill. So if we have to write this statement in if-then form, we're going to modify it a little bit, but we're going to keep the truthfulness of the statement intact. We're going to say if someone has 4/4, then they can exchange it for a $1 bill. We modified the statement by inserting a few words, but we definitely put the statement in if-then form. All right, our hypothesis would be someone having 4/4. Our conclusion would be that they can exchange it for a $1 bill. Everybody okay with that? All right. Let's look at that statement there on example 2B. The sum of the measures of two supplementary angles is 180. And we're going to take this information and we're going to write it in if-then form. And we're going to say that if two angles are supplementary, if two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180 degrees. All right, so our hypothesis would be the two angles are supplementary. Conclusion, their sum is 180. All right, so again, the hypothesis follows the if, the conclusion follows the then. We're taking an information statement and we're writing it in if-then form. All right, so moving forward from there, we need to look at the table on the page, on the bottom of page 109. And this table deals with related conditionals. So we're going to get this table in your notes today. And then tomorrow we're going to do a little bit more practice with it. So we talked about this yesterday. A conditional statement is a statement that can be written in the form if then. So we've got a conditional. It's if then. The symbol for that conditional is if P, then Q. The P represents the hypothesis, Q represents the conclusion. And then an example would be if the measure of angle A is 35 degrees, then angle A is acute. Hypothesis follows the if, conclusion follows the then. Now, the statements that relate to this conditional, we have three statements that relate to this conditional. The first one is called the converse. It's formed by exchanging P and Q. So it's formed by exchanging the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the symbol for the converse is if Q, then P. So when we write the converse of this conditional, we're going to say if an angle is acute, then its measure is 35 degrees. Now, all we're doing is we're focused on switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. We're not concerned about the truth value because this statement is actually false, isn't it? If an angle is acute, then its measure is 35 degrees. That would be considered false because an angle can measure anything less than 90, right? So an angle can be acute and measure 40 degrees. So that would be what's called a counterexample. It's an example of this statement being false. All right. The third related conditional is called an inverse. The inverse of a statement is formed by negating P and Q. Formed by negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. Here's the symbol. This little squiggly line P, arrow, squiggly line Q. You would read that if not P, then not Q. The squiggly line means negate or add the word not. And you read this, if not P, then not Q. So we're going back to the original conditional statement right here. And we're going to negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. We're going to say, if the measure of angle A is not 35 degrees, then angle A is not acute. And that statement would be false as well, wouldn't it? Because you can have an angle that's not 35 degrees. It could be 40 degrees. But since 40 is still less than 90, then the angle is still acute. So if you were asked to determine the truth value of the inverse, it would be false. Counterexample would be an angle that measures 40 degrees. All right, and then your final related statement is called a contrapositive. And a contrapositive is formed by negating the converse. So we go back up here where the converse had a symbol of if Q then P. So we're just going to negate the converse. So we're going to say if not conclusion, then not hypothesis. So we go back to our converse, we go back to the statement, if an angle is acute. All right, in the converse, an angle is acute was our hypothesis. So we're going to say if an angle is not acute, then its measure is not 35 degrees. And if you were asked to give that statement a truth value, if an angle is not acute, well, if it's not acute, it's either right or obtuse. And it has to measure 90 degrees, between 90 and 180, inclusive. So if an angle is not acute, then its measure is not 35 degrees. That's true, isn't it? If it's not acute, it's obtuse or right, its measure is not going to be 35 degrees. It would have to be 90 to 180 inclusive. All right. So those are the four related statements: a conditional, a converse, an inverse, and a contrapositive. All right. The easiest way to remember these four statements is to take this table that we just wrote and condense it to this. And then memorize this table. We've got conditional, symbol for conditional, P arrow Q. Converse, Q arrow P. If Q, then P. Inverse, negate the original. So if not P, then not Q. And then finally, the contrapositive. And that's where we negate the converse. So if not Q, then not P. All right, we know what a conditional is. It's an if-then statement. If hypothesis, then conclusion. So if we remember this order right here, conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive. And then just look what happens. We go if P, then Q. Converse is if Q, then P. Inverse, if not P, then not Q. Contrapositive, if not Q, then not P. All right, all we do in the first two is switch the order. All we do in the second two is negate in order and then negate by switching the order of the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right. So I want you to do some practice today. And you are going to write some conditional statements. And then I'm going to have you write a couple of these related conditionals. So we're going to start on page 112. (26) through 28. Write each statement in if-then form. That's all you're going to be doing. And then on the page 113, 47 through 49. In those problems, you're going to write the conditional. They're giving you the conditional. You're going to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. When you write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive, I want you to use this notation. You're going to start off with the conditional. And you can just write it COND. And then the converse will just go CON. And then when you write the inverse, INV. And then for the contrapositive, we can go CTP. All right, and to help you memorize this for Friday's quiz, I would write conditional, P arrow Q, and then I would write the conditional statement that's given. This is for problems 47 through 49. Converse, Q arrow P, and then write the converse of the original conditional. For the inverse, not P, then not Q. And then write your inverse. And then for the contrapositive, write the symbol again. If not Q, then not P. All right, that way you're practicing memorizing conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive, and the symbol that goes with each. Because once you memorize that material in that order, writing these four statements is very simple. All right, so that's your practice for today. Be sure that you're checking your odd answers as you're doing the assignment. And if you have any questions while you're writing these statements, please come see me.